So thanks everybody for coming tonight for our second journal club of 2022. And this kind of follows suit from what we've been talking about the last several months. In December, we talked about the winter solstice, of course, and then January, we kind of followed up on the heels of that with the first of Mike Zellick's papers on the ethnoastronomy of the historic Pueblos, part 1, sun watching. And tonight we're following up with part 2, moon watching, and timed this to the Pauamu February ceremonies from Hopi. And we paired the paper with lunar standstills at Chimney Rock to discuss the comparisons of the historic Pueblo ethnographic record with the archaeological record from much earlier. So I just did a quick review here of some of the things we've been talking about in the McCluskey paper that we talked about several months ago, where we went through his paper on the Hopi ceremonial calendar. We discussed the ceremonies that were timed by sun watchers from various Pueblos, whether they were on the roofs of buildings for the Hopi, watching sunset over the San Francisco mountains, and how the interim ceremonies were timed by the moon, such as Pauamu, and some by the snake, antelope, and the flute festivals, and how McCluskey used Fourier analysis to show the periodicity of the celebration dates, and how their calendar was lunisolar, and that's kind of just to catch us up to where we've been talking about. So I took this a little bit out of order. Zellick doesn't start his conversation with the discussion of Pauamu, but since it's February and it's the time of the year, I thought maybe we could open up discussions on this calendar.
Before we go any further, Chris, may I ask a naive question to the panel?
Absolutely.
What I'm interested in is the idea of 13 lunations. I mean, I understand, you get 12 full ones, but there were a lot of the Pueblos talk about tracking 13 months.
Sure.
I just want to hear some feedback on that.
Yeah, and this is not a formal presentation by any stretch of the imagination. This is an informal discussion. I just put this together to help kind of guide the discussion, not to dominate it in any way. So I certainly welcome input, at any time by anybody. Obviously, 12 lunations is 354 days, which falls 11 days short of the solar year. And 13 lunations is, I believe, 17 days longer than their solar year. And so those two cycles not being commensurate, they're never going to really line up. And typically, many cultures across the planet would recognize the 12 months, and then every 3 years they would intercalate a 13th month into that year to bring their lunar calendar in line with the seasons. Now, it's my understanding, and I wish Brian were here, but my understanding that many of the cultures of the Four Corners region, like the Hopi, used a 13-month year, and their method of intercalation, instead of adding an extra month, they took away an extra month, or in some instances they took away part of a month. So they had a kind of flip on the way many cultures intercalated.
I think, in Zellick's article, there was even a comment there that in some cases, like you said, some took away months, some added a month. In some cases, quite frequently, they just ignored the problem altogether.
Yeah.
But so Greg, may I just ask again? I'm really excited to be part of this panel. So this is great. So Greg, can you acknowledge that the ancestral Puebloan peoples, and well, even the modern Puebloan peoples, I understood that you had the beginning of a 13th lunation, a truncated lunation, if you will. Is that accurate? Or
For me personally, I'm not that familiar with the literature on that particular point.
So I focus mostly on the Maya, and the Mayas may have been unique in the Americas, that they had actually zodiacal constellations, and they had 13 zodiacal constellations for 13 months of the year. So they recognized 13 months. The Hopi, I believe, as well, and we'll find here one of the findings of Zielig's research in our first paper is the Pueblos that recognize 12 lunar months likely got that idea from the Spanish, and that was a westernization of their calendar. So his argument, I have noted here later on, that if you see 12 lunar months in the Puebloan cultures, it's likely not indigenous. But yeah, that's a great question, and very, very pertinent to tonight's topic. Absolutely. Greg, do you have anything maybe you want to add about Pawamu or the ceremonies?
Only other than I've had the honor of witnessing it and being in Giva.
Oh wow.
And it's an amazing experience. Just being with the fact, I think that's one of the things that we're looking at, is that this would be a good subject for future discussions with our Native American consultants and friends, is about these kinds of things and how they view the moon today.
Yeah, Mary teaches us.
A part of that is getting to know families, visiting, and learning about their culture directly, and gaining their trust.
Mary teased us last month about joining tonight and discussing their melting of the ice ceremony. So I was kind of hoping she would have been online too. That would have been very interesting to hear. But this ceremony, the one time to February, their winter bean ceremony, is timed by moon watching after the winter solstice. It says here, he mentions that McCluskey demonstrates that the low opinion of Hopi astronomy wasn't warranted, and their lunar festivals, especially Pawamu, the winter bean ceremony, McCluskey found it's a pattern of intercalation hinting at the tonic cycle to keep solar and lunar observations in line. Pawamu is linked to the solar observations that determine Soyal, which is the winter solstice ceremony, even though it's timed by observations of the phase of the moon. And his informant here, he calls the intercalation or adjustment breaking up of the moon, where he eliminates a couple of days after the winter solstice. And that's just another means of intercalating to help keep the festival somewhat in line with the seasons. He spends the first good chunk of the paper talking about the Zuni Shalako ceremony, This is just a little bit I grabbed out of Wikipedia at the top. And this ceremony dates around mid-November towards mid-December. And the ceremonies were held within 49 days of the October full moon, which could, go a little bit later. So this was the Zuni lunar ceremony that was important, and it kind of almost lines up with the Hopi ceremony that starts their new year, but that was, of course, determined by sunrise, as we learned last month.
And that's the one with the string, right? Don't they untie a knot? Like there's 49 knots, isn't that correct? They untie a knot each time, right?
Yeah, that method was used, I think, both at Zuni and Hopi, if I'm not mistaken.
Does anyone know anything more about Pueblo traditions of knot tying and counting, and any like comparisons with quipus?
Oh, quipus.
In the Andes. I mean, different, but also, using knot tying for enumeration.
Well, the quipu, I mean, the knot untying here and tying and untying here is more of a method they use to determine, I think, the correct date of the solstices, right? Because they're so hard to determine just visually. I mean, when you get to the solstice, the sun hardly moves at all, and it's pretty imperceptible. But if they had the anticipatory observations where they could see, where the sun was over a certain peak, they could tie knots towards the solstice and then keep tying knots and till the sun returns to that peak, and then they have kind of like a framework, to follow up on later, where they can tie knots and untie knots to determine the exact date of the solstice, where visually it might be imperceptible, as opposed to the quipu, which were record-keeping devices. We know that they recorded tribute, and there's maybe half a dozen examples where actual astronomical or calendrical information was recorded in the quipus. And the jury's still out on whether or not it was more than that. I think Gary Ayrton believes that the quipus may have possibly have recorded language. And one of the examples cited is that the Spanish gathered all the Cupucamayos from the area to read their quipus, and they recorded the history down from the quipu, and then of course burned the quipu and killed the Cupucamayo. So that they are very, very different. I mean, it is ingenious how the Pueblo people used the knot tying and untying for counting, but it's it doesn't approach the level of the quipu.
There was there was in Dalik's article for tonight the examples of the counting sticks.
Mm-hmm.
There's two sticks that he had. The one was a Hopi, I think one was a Zuni.
Mm-hmm.
And one did a year, but the other one didn't quite do the Hopi one didn't quite do a year, so they weren't quite sure how it worked. There's also a reference in some of Fuchs's papers about an instrument used to measure the amplitude of the sun on the horizon. So they did have, it seems, ways of keeping track of these kinds of things. And I think that's one of the things I would like to look into a lot more, is to find those artifacts again, take another look at them.
Yeah.
Do some modeling on them so that we can look at them and study them here. Part of the Fuchs project.
In a couple of months, we're going to be looking at a couple of papers specifically on calendar sticks. One by Marshak. But yeah, that is definitely very interesting. And I wonder how much of that is survives really. Well, anybody have any further input before I'm kind of going to move on to a next phase of the discussion. So I talked a little about the ceremonies. Then I want to jump to the very end of his paper. He comes up with 7 distinct conclusions from his paper from the historic Pueblo period. And his first one is, whenever a Pueblo is reported to have 12 months, to John's point, it has probably adopted the Gregorian calendar, discarded its Aboriginal one. The 12-month calendar allows no flexibility for the intercalation of the seasonal year. And I guess you might want to add to that, it adds no flexibility if you're removing dates. I mean, of course, if you're adding months, I think I would dispute that claim. And then, for example, he uses the Keres site of Laguna, which they described as a demoralized 12-month calendar that had adopted all Western Christian names for the months. And here that the rain priest would count 6 moons from summer solstice to determine the time of the winter solstice. And he points out that that's certainly nowhere near accurate enough to have had serious, taken seriously, probably even in the prehistoric time. But this certainly touches on your point about the 13 lunar months and the differences between our 12 months. So his second point is that he says one indigenous calendar has 12 months based on observations of the first visible crescent. Intercalation consisted of dropping 1 month regularly every 3 years, or dropping part of a month more often. Such practices result in reports of 14 months in a year. And the calendar he's talking about specifically was the Tawa. He reported that the Tawa month began at the first visible crescent, and it was 12 months long, divided into summer and winter months. And then at San Ildefonso, the rain priest of the sun and the ice moieties, representing summer and winter, observed the rising and setting of the moon from the roof of the house in which his precious Tikan rests. And then just one more, I think this is the third. And then he mentions here that another Aboriginal practice had 10 months of 30 days each. Each of these was counted, then some period of time was not counted, that around the winter solstice and the beginning of the new year. And this talks a little bit about one of the things that's found on some of the calendar sticks that many of the Pueblos, and he mentions here specifically Keres and the Kia Pueblo, they had a month of 30 days. Now, it talks a little bit later how those 30-day months were broken down into 10-day weeks, and track that way. So when he says not counted, of course, 30 days times 10 months, a 10th year of 30 days is 300 days. 10-month year, yeah, that's certainly far away from our tropical year. And then one of the things from the second paper I threw in here is it is part of the I would imagine frustration of trying to make these things commensurate, because the Zuni attempted to have their calendar organized that the winter solstice occurred at the same time as the December full moon, which of course it only occasionally does, and you can't make it do that. But one of the things I noticed was that was pretty close this past December. If anybody was watching, just about winter solstice, we had a really big, bright new moon. I mean, full moon. Kind of made me think of this. So I think this is if I check, I think this might be the majority of what he was talking about with the lunar months. If we keep going, his fourth conclusion was that the naming of the months typically involved 5 or 6 months for the first half of the year, and those same month names were repeated for the second half of the year, based upon their notion of duality. And it talks about how they would say, you know, the 5 months of summer and the 5 months of winter pretty much represent the upper world and the underworld. So for instance, you know, Pawamu in February, which is a time of planting, would be a time of harvesting in the underworld. Any thoughts on that? I certainly don't want to dominate the discussion if anybody's got any points on that.
Well, just correct me if I'm wrong, but so I always think of it as the idea is that if you have a strong moon, then you have to have, it's got to couple with a weak sun. And if you have a strong sun, like at the solstices, it's got to couple with a weak moon. That's what I've read. I don't, you know, correct me if that's not accurate.
I'm not familiar with that particular thought, but I don't know. Greg, does that?
May I make a comment? I think that's a Zuni tradition, as I understand it. Jane Young has a lovely book on Zuni traditions, and has a big discussion of the Zunis in particular like to have balance, as John mentioned, weak sun and a strong moon, namely weak sun at winter solstice would be coupled with a strong moon, namely a full moon, and a strong sun at summer solstice would be coupled with a weak moon, namely a new moon, or the very first crescent of a new moon. And that's what we've been talking about a little bit earlier. So according to Zuni, this idea, there was the idea of marking a period 2 weeks before a solstice. And we have a number of places in the Southwest where we have observations of the sun occurring 2 weeks before solstice. And one of the interpretations of that was anticipation in order to get ready. But that probably wasn't the case with the Zuni. 2 weeks before solstice would begin a period of 1 month, of one lunar month, such that the next full moon during that period of time, or the next new moon during that period of time, would be the time for the celebration of solstice. And it could occur anytime during that 30-day period. And so one would have a floating date for the solstice ceremonies based upon the next full moon or the next new moon during that 30-day period. And I think Mike talks about sometimes the difficulty that the sun watcher had at Zuni, and sometimes there were a couple of instances where the sun watcher was forced out of the village because he made an error. And that you could see is something that would be fairly easy to do if you're just looking for the next new moon or the next full moon during a certain period of time. So the idea of balance is pretty interesting.
So I have another, well, connected to that, since I have two astronomers sitting there. So is the fixation for the idea of trying to get a full moon at the winter solstice, is that what led to the knowledge of the major lunar standstills in the Southwest? Is that fixation to find that, you know, that synchronicity, is that what led to knowing that there's a major lunar standstill?
I don't think they're connected. I think every year you're going to be looking for that kind of connection. And I think winter solstice is the more common celebration. And so they're always looking for the full moon. So the time for the major winter solstice ceremony would be, according to this tradition, the time of the full moon. And it didn't matter where the moon was. It didn't matter whether it was major, minor, or anywhere in between. To rely upon a major standstill, you've got this 18-year periodicity that would complicate everything.
Then how did they learn that?
About a major lunar standstill?
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that in the next paper, but you
Yes,
need to have
right.
you need to have a good horizon so that you can pay attention to exactly where the moon is on that horizon. If it's absolutely flat, you're going to have to work very hard to establish where the moon is relative to the sun at the time of the solstices. Whereas at one of my favorite places like Chimney Rock, then you have a very, very clear-cut situation where the sun stops at summer solstice at a certain point on the horizon and never, ever gets beyond that. Whereas at major lunar standstill, it does something that the sun is not able to do. And from the great house, the moon comes in between the two towers, so that this is purely a observational experience, you know. And if you're living up there on the high mesa and you're paying attention to, and you're seeing where the moon rises or the sun rises, it's a no-brainer that every once in a while the moon does something the sun cannot do. And that in a sense, you can imagine that sort of a discontinuity in terms of belief systems. The sun is presumably more powerful than the moon, and here's a situation where the moon is able to better the sun in terms of where it rises.
Well, Kim, I didn't see you slide in here, but I'm certainly glad that you have. I'll lean more heavily on you now.
So that's why it worked at like Zodiac Ridge, because it's a pretty serrated horizon.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a characteristic of the Southwest, where you have distant horizons that are irregular. I'm not sure. I don't think there's places where there's no horizon at all, like the Yucatan, for example. They probably, you just have a jungle, and there's no obvious way, easy way to identify a time of the major lunar standstill. But yeah, the Southwest is perfect for that. Clear skies, long distance horizon, and irregular horizon. It would be very easy to identify the major lunar standstill.
When you look at it the other way, in a sense, the moon is on one side of the rising point of the sun, and then it goes through the sun and comes to the other side of where it rises. And sometimes it's important that the moon coincides with the sun on the horizon. And that's halfway between the standstills.
Okay.
So are you talking about the crossover of the sun and the moon?
Yeah,
Yeah,
basically.
like Fabio Silva suggested might be a target in some European sites.
The work we did at the Bull Creek Basin, near the site that we're, the other paper for this discussion, I think is connected with just that type of observation. At the time that the moon lines up with the sun at the halfway between the major standstill and the minor standstill in time. So interesting possibilities.
Sure. As we discussed briefly, his fifth conclusion was that two of the Pueblos that he discussed used calendar sticks, and he infers that it was a common practice. Like I said, we're gonna talk a little bit more about the calendar sticks in a couple months. The two Pueblos he's talking about, of course, Zuni and Hopi. And he talks about Fuchs describing its use for determining the time of year. But we've already talked about that. His sixth conclusion was the Pueblo people feared eclipses and had no way to predict them. Any thoughts on that, anybody? I mean, the Maya, their neighbors to the south, obviously, were able to pretty accurately predict eclipses. And this is shown in their Dresden lunar tables. That knowledge apparently didn't make it this far north. Even though they could not predict eclipses, Hawketot talks about a much later historical period where eclipses were used to certainly help bolster fledgling religions that were used to consolidate some of the tribes against the encroachment on their territory, which is an interesting tie. Makes you kind of wonder where that knowledge came from if they weren't able to predict it themselves.
Back again to this idea of the solstice being the full moon. You can see, in addition to the particularly dangerous aspect of a lunar eclipse, in that the moon gets blood red, and it's a very, very slow process. And it's one where many people can see the lunar eclipse. To anticipate the next solstice event in winter being a full moon, and you have an eclipse at that time, you'd think that would be an absolute disaster. And so there certainly would be some benefit to a sun watcher or a calendar person to be able to anticipate an eclipsed full moon in December, for example.
And then number 7, and I guess the pivot point probably of our conversation, was his conclusion that there was no clear indication of observations of an 18.6 year lunar standstill cycle relative to the horizon. And he states early in his paper that the Puebloans kept no long counts greater than a year, no chronologies. The year was all that was important, and once it's ended, it started again. So I guess maybe to back up is in case there's anybody that is not really sure what we meant by lunar standstill or northern maximum or lunar minimums. Is there anybody here that would need a more explanation on that, or is everybody pretty much have that concept? Good to go? All right, so that leaves the first paper behind us and brings us to prehistoric moon watching at Chimney Rock, a paper by
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to mess the flow up here. So I just have a question then. How obviously ancestral Pueblo and peoples did know the major lunar standstill, but how was that lost? Any comments on that?
I don't think it's obvious that they knew about major lunar standstill. There are certain places where if they have a good horizon, and again, especially Chimney Rock, that would be something that would be easy to detect. I'm not sure, for example, that folks in that Shalako was familiar with the idea of a major lunar standstill, and especially not a minor lunar standstill. I think there are two features to this. One is this observation that has no practical consequence at all. Of course, there's no benefit whatsoever for knowing the date of a major lunar standstill. So I think it's basically the significance of where the moon rises on the horizon. And here we have both a way of detecting the events, the experience, but also a conjoining of two sacred features of the world, namely the sacred land that's evident on the horizon, and the sacred moon or the sacred sun. So for some people, I feel this is a very spiritual experience to watch the behavior, to see the behavior of sacredness in the heavens and sacredness on the earth, and the joining of the two particular events, particular features on the horizon, could have been a very powerful spiritual experience. We really don't know for sure, but I think we need to break away from the idea that this is purely a mechanical calendar. That's very Western. It wasn't just a timepiece; it was a feature of the sacred realm of the ancestral Pueblos. But anyhow, I'm not sure how many people knew about lunar standstills.
Well, yeah, it's important to remember that the solstices are recorded in cultures all over the globe, all through time. And there's not really any ethnographic record of any mention of a lunar standstill in any culture, actually. The first time the idea of a moon rise position on a horizon was mentioned in literature was Somerville in the early 20th century. And then it was kind of brushed off until Alexander Thom invented the term lunar standstill in it was the 60s, right? 65 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first time it kind of entered the conversation from that perspective. I mentioned before there's an interesting chapter by Garcia in the Handbook of Archaeoastronomy and Ethnoastronomy, where he talks about lunar alignments, and he mentions 3 specific places on the planet where lunar alignments might have some sort of ethnographic tie to them. One of them's a temple of Thoth in ancient Egypt, and he was associated with the moon. And this temple may be pointed to a lunar maximum. building a Petra aligned to, that was used as a dedication to a lunar god. And the third one, I'm having trouble thinking off the top of my head where that one might be.
It's the Great Pyramid of Ur.
That's it. Yep. Perfect. Yep. And the third one is Ur, and Nana, the god of the moon, I believe was Nana.
Samaria.
And so those three are actual temples to lunar deities that may point to the lunar maximum. And then we have Chimney Rock, which of course we have no ethnographic information for because it's prehistoric and they didn't have writing. So all we have here is archaeology.
And then may I haste to point out we have Mesa Verde and
Sun Temple.
and the Sun Temple and Cliff Palace.
What I think we show here is we have monumental architecture being dedicated to the observation of the event. Possibly, was it just that? Was it just the observation of the event itself? Or did there have to be meaning behind it, cultural meaning behind it? That's a question we have to ask. Maybe we're not asking the right questions, or the right questions weren't asked when the ethnographic information was being collected or being asked in the right way. I think we have to be open to the fact that maybe we just haven't discovered the meaning yet.
Well, that's absolutely true.
I don't think we ever will fully. But in the case of Mesa Verde and the Sun Temple, Greg, and we were talking about a horizon in the southwest that is serrated and is very easy, therefore, to mark the position of the sun and the moon, whether it be solstice or lunar standstill. And in the case of the Sun Temple, of course, there was already that eroded rock that may have been significant, but the Sun Temple itself may have been built to be an artificial marker for both the winter solstice sunset and the major lunar standstill moonset.
And Kim, I just wanted to mention that we both did work there, and I did some work there in 2007, and I actually have a video of the moon setting into Sun Temple. So if I could share my screen.
Oh, sure, that would be great.
Awesome.
Somehow.
When was this, Greg?
This was in June 2nd of 2007, the very end of the lunar standstill cycle in 2007. And here you have the Sun Temple on the far side from Cliff Palace. And this tree marks the center of where the two towers would have been. They were probably built first, marking the position, and then the surrounding walls built after covering it over. But this is the way the event it looks today after it was all completed.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And so what I think we have here is a situation where, and the sun does this at Sun Temple also from a marked spot to the south end on the exit trail, the winter solstice sun. And in Zylick's paper, he was talking about there was a house for the sun. And in essence, what I think this creates is the house for the winter sun and the lunar standstill moon.
Chris,
Okay.
I guess I have
was
a
that a
question.
was that a major standstill or a minor?
That was a southern major lunar standstill.
Major, okay.
And you can, as Greg well knows, you can watch the winter solstice sunset from a Peck Basin at the end of Cliff Palace, and you can watch the major lunar standstill from the four-story square tower.
That picture, yeah, that photo was taken. That video was taken out in front of the space. It would have been online with the 4-story tower. You know, there's a lot of architectural details that we won't know what they were. But I do know that, you know, it was probably a public event at that point, because the area out in front would have, everybody would have seen this event. So this was probably a public event at the time.
Well, there's a covered kiva there that would provide a very large place to stand. There.
Several of them, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main event. It may not have been this secret little event observed by just a few people. It was probably part of a larger social festival.
Did you say, just to clarify, the sun event, kind of the same thing, is actually seen from a different location? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the way out of Cliff Palace, there's a little flattened platform of sandstone with a basin pecked into it about that big around.
I see.
And
I guess it would have to, if it was a major standstill, the sun wouldn't
Yeah.
go that far anyway.
There's an angular difference there.
it's an angular difference. And so that's, you know, so what it does is they created Sun Temple on the horizon, on a flat horizon, as a horizon marker. Now,
Well, I think the Sun Temple itself was very sacred and important too. So
Yeah.
it was a combination of two phenomena.
right. And so how it was all used, we don't really know, and probably never will.
Did you have a question, Al?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like Kim and Greg, when you guys are, you know, writing these papers and kind of evaluating all the different types of evidence, like there's so many different kinds of like types of information we can gather, right? Because there's like modern ethnography from the early 1900s. Then there's like photographic evidence, like we just saw. And then there's also like the chronology that in Kim's paper, like to me is really compelling. So there's all these different types of evidence, and like, how do you guys think about weighing them differently to make like the argument or the claim of these kinds of astronomical knowledge?
I mainly go off the architecture. I run off the architecture itself, document the architecture, let the architecture speak for itself, tell you what it is about. And that's part of what we're doing. Coming up for the workshop coming up here is starting to work on documentation packages, how to record information so that we can interpret it later on. So that's part of it. As far as the ethnographic part of it, I know the big argument is always when there's no ethnographic information for it. I think a lot of the ethnographic information was collected back in the late 1800s, was collected maybe in a way that didn't collect everything that needed to be known or should be known, and I still think that we're looking at information that we're not ready to know yet, or maybe we shouldn't know. We have to be sensitive to those kinds of things. Philip, there, you know, we just worked on that. There was an article in the Colorado Sun newspaper about Sun Temple. And Philip had some very good things to say about that.
So my experience was
modern. We got to work with the modern people more and learn, sit, gain trust, and I think we'll come to better understandings that way.
So my experience was entirely doing field work with a theodolite, and it was a time at Mesa Verde when one could wander across the top of the Sun Temple, which you can't do now. And so I spent some time trying to figure out exactly what the astronomy of the Sun Temple was, because it was really sort of an enigma. There was no clear, up until about, well, 1988, 89, 90, we really didn't know what the astronomy of the Sun Temple could be. So I was on the wall of the Sun Temple with a theodolite and set the theodolite up to the position of the setting sun at winter solstice, and looked across the canyon, and we found where it was this peck basin and a platform. So it was just purely just trying to figure out the geometry of the architecture. And then a year or two later, actually also sort of inspired by our discovery of the major lunar standstill at Chimney Rock, I went back to the Sun Temple and set the theodolite up for the orientation of the moon at major lunar standstill sun moonset, and aligned the theodolite with the tangent to the two tower kivas in there, and flipped the theodolite, and there we were looking at the window in the third story of the square tower. So it's just purely just field work, doggedly trying to figure out what the meaning of the temple was in terms of astronomy. And Greg was involved with me on some of that, of course.
Philip Kowalski, I have a question. I was very interested in your theodolite work. My question is, what was your reference direction? How did you determine your reference direction?
Oh, I could figure out the azimuth. I knew the azimuth of the sun at lunar solstice, and the azimuth of the moon at major lunar standstill moonset. So I just
it was a solar azimuth.
Yes, yeah, and you know, I mean, just regular azimuth where 0 is of course is true north. So I would have to use the theodolite to I would do sun measurements of the sun to determine true north, and then align the azimuth dial on the theodolite to those two particular azimuths, the moon and the sun.
In regard to the question of how do you approach a site, so to speak, I like the criterion set by Aubrey Burrell in Britain. And you have to have three things. You have to have something that indicates where the observer should be. You have something that he should look at. And then the third thing is that the sightline so defined should be astronomically important, particularly in nearby culture or in sites that are similarly found. So those three steps are a start toward archaeoastronomy.
Right. Well, the solstices, of course, as we've been discussing, are ubiquitous in their importance. In terms of the major lunar standstill, you know, we had discovered that at Chimney Rock in what today is 2222, and our discovery of the major lunar standstill at Chimney Rock was on 8/8/88. I'm sort of pleased at that, August 8th, 1988. After that, we had a number of moonrise events organized by the Forest Service at Chimney Rock, and I did one, and it was cloudy, and I think this was 1990, and sitting there, somewhat being very disappointed, I began to think about major lunar standstill moonset at Mesa Verde. So it was the inspiration of what we found at Chimney Rock that led me to look for that particular angle, Fred, for the major lunar standstill at Mesa Verde. Normally you wouldn't expect that, of course, because there's no practical consequence of knowing the 18.6-year cycle of the lunar standstill. But in this case, I've suggested that the people who were in Cliff Palace had some memory of what the event was at Chimney Rock, and they carried that out in at Mesa Verde. And in particular, we had the two towers at Chimney Rock, and then we have the two tower kivas at the Sun Temple.
They were never very tall, though.
Pardon me?
They were never very tall.
Yes, but as you pointed out, they probably built the kivas first, and then for some time they would have been visible, and clearly from the Sun Temple, from Cliff Palace, and then there was a wall that was built, and then they couldn't have been seen very easily.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
Mesa Verde, are you viewing that standstill moon set from the tower at Cliff Palace? And what story are you in?
Oh, you can observe it either from the window on the fourth story, or from the area in front of it.
Yeah. Actually, there's the yes, what you're talking about is the 4-story, what's called the Painted Tower in Cliff Palace. There are a good chunk of that tower that most of the left half of it was gone. So the part that Kim was first discovered when he looked through his theodolite was probably there. I have gone up and looked through it after it was reconstructed, and it was almost impossible to see Cliff Palace or see Sun Temple across the way, because you had to be really cocked in the corner. Down in the corner of the room is a sealed opening, a little loophole about that big around. And it would have gone straight through the wall and looked over at Sun Temple. So there was clearly an orientation from that tower, either through features or publicly from down below.
A follow-up on that is you're saying the moon would have set between, or would have set where those two towers, kivas, are at Sun Temple? Would it have set between them, like you see it rise at Chimney Rock?
It
Could
would
be.
have been very similar, yeah. Well, if they could have been seen at the time, they may have been to set up the mark and then surrounded to create the house. But yes.
So yes, there's a possibility that there was a gap between the towers, the round, those kivas, that could have permitted a view of the moon setting between those two towers. It is an intriguing possibility, because we have two towers at Chimney Rock and constructed towers at the Sun Temple at Mesa Verde.
And the idea of a D-shaped structure, such as Sun Temple with two kivas or towers, is not, Sun Temple is not the only one that looks like that. There's a tradition of D-shaped structures in the central Mesa Verde region, but only in the central Mesa Verde region. So what we need to do is get beyond, Chimney Rock and Sun Temple are two very good examples. But what we are going to be doing as a society is developing a documentation package where we can go to a place like, if we came to a place like Sun Temple, or a D-shaped structure, or other monumental architecture, and go into that place and start looking at that structure, doing a building and landscape orientation survey, where we look at that structure and how it relates to its environment, not only locally, but distant, horizon features, relationships to other sites. So we're going to start building that database, and then we can start looking at these sites. And the more evidence we see for occurrences of observation, the more evidence we have for it in the Southwest.
I have two more questions, but they might, I don't know. Well, so Greg, you said that your emphasis is on architecture, and then Kim, you were talking about, field work with theolites. Where does ethnography play into that, and ethnographic evidence? These papers are kind of, or at least the first one, Zalix, is like really heavy on ethnography. So how do you guys value that? And then also, what do you think of Fajada Butte Sun Dagger?
Well, that in terms of ethnography of Chimney Rock, I think there's some very interesting ethnography in terms of the two rock towers are identified by the Taos in the Taos Pueblo as the twin war gods, or the two divine twins of the Pueblos. This was learned by Florence Hawley Ellis, who had visited the area with elders of the Taos Pueblo, and the idea of the sacred moon, and the moon is indeed has that quality, juxtaposing itself between the two divine twins has a lot of power, and so that strikes me as an attempt at understanding this in terms of ethnography. We also think that Chimney Rock was probably a minor pilgrimage destination, where people who would come up to watch the moon between these two, the two divine twins, or the twin war gods, as something that was very, very serious, very, very important, and very, very meaningful for the culture. So there's some ethnography in terms of Chimney Rock.
Yeah, as far as Sun Temple over at Mesa Verde, it's the Pueblo ethnography is very difficult. We haven't, for lunar standstills anyways. But then again, I think, again, the ethnography from the first paper, Blake's paper, delved into the ethnography from the early days. So one of the things we have to do is I want to go back and look at the records themselves to see what more there might be there. But I think we also have a lot more talking to do with the modern native peoples. We've had a lot more learning to do. We've got the ethnography is still there, maybe, if it can be shared. So we have more work to do there. And that's one thing, none of the research projects in the past included was a consultation component. And I think that has changed a lot. Now there's a lot more involvement of the Native American peoples to be involved in research projects, to maybe share that once they get to know you.
So the Chimney Rock situation with Florence Hawley Ellis is indeed pure what Greg is talking about, that Florence Hawley Ellis had a grant to interpret Mesa Verde with the elders of the Taos Pueblo. And she drove them over to Mesa Verde to ask their ideas about interpretation of Mesa Verde. And on the way, they stopped just north of Chimney Rock, and and without asking them directly, they just volunteered that these two towers were shrines to the twin war gods of the Pueblos. One has to be very careful and respectful about native traditions, and not be too forceful about trying to extract ethnographic information from them.
So more work to do.
Kim, I really love your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me share out what I thought was probably And can you guys see this again?
Right.
Yeah.
What I probably thought was the takeaway of Kim's paper. The statement that it was not necessary for those responsible for planning and construction to have knowledge of the 18.6-year lunar cycle. The anticipatory observations of moonrise at the start of each northern major standstill were clearly possible, and an accurate year count would have been unnecessary. I think that's a very important statement about the site. Not that they were, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but not that they were looking to build something here to memorialize this phenomena, but discovered it. And I think that's what really makes this site unique. I mean, would you agree with that assessment, Kim?
Oh, yeah, I think so. And I think initially when we first worked on it, I was influenced by Frank Eddy, who had suggested that it was built by people coming up from Chaco. I think that's an unnecessary complication. I think it was there's an issue of emulation that doesn't. The people at Chimney Rock knew that there was something very important going on, which they just happened to discover. The two towers were sacred to them, and they wanted to build something to make it even more important, to emulate what was going on down in Chaco Canyon. And so I think the Chimney Rock Great House was not built by masons walking up from Chaco, but was probably built by people from Salmon Ruins, which was halfway there, very close to them. And the interesting thing is that there's a guardhouse, which is on that map, that completely controls access to the upper mesa. And the guardhouse is not Chaco construction. It is, you can see 84, the guardhouse is not Chaco architecture. It is purely local architecture. So it appears as though the locals asked other people, like from Salmon, to build a great house similar to those in Chaco, and then they controlled access to it by building their own guardhouse. So it's a really nice combination of something that is very powerful in terms of meaning of great houses in Chaco, but a very local experience at Chimney Rock.
Which of those is built earlier? Are there dates for the two types of construction?
Oh, there are two, as you probably know, Fred, there are two tree ring dates that we have for construction, major construction events. One is 1076 and the other is 1093. Both of those are, of course, standstill dates. So there were two episodes of construction up there. I think the more serious one resulted in the very complex Chimney Rock Great House that we see there now. The 1076 one, there was a kiva that was built that was fairly crude as far as we can tell, that was improved upon in 1093. But 1076 also involved the construction of the great kiva, of the great kiva at Chimney Rock, and that again is something that is local plus Chaco, not extreme, not one or the other, and again apparently is an evidence of the locals wanting to build something similar to what was down in Chaco, but was part of their own religious traditions.
Well, my question was whether the guardhouse could possibly have been earlier. Particularly, I've always been fascinated by the bear figurine that was found in it, being similar to the bear figurines in Newark, Ohio. And if it was earlier, that would be a significant finding, that the guardhouse was earlier.
Unfortunately, during that, as Frank Eddy commented, that guardhouse has been overly misused by archaeologists, and has been completely torn down, as you well know. And there's no
way to tell. Okay.
You know, we have no evidence there of any dating on the guardhouse.
What I'm curious what the reasoning is of Salmon being the source of the Great House rather than Chaco.
Well, it's halfway, it's closer. For people to come up from Chaco to build a great house for the folks in Chimney Rock, they would have essentially had to go up the North Road and walk past Salmon. So Salmon had available masons, and we know the dates of construction of at Salmon. There was a gap at 1090 in the early 1090s, so that the masons in Salmon could have gone up to work on the great house at Chimney Rock. Salmon also has the same kind of masonry structures that Chimney Rock has at that same period of time in the 1090s. And as you probably know, it has its own major lunar standstill marker. There is an altar built into the Salmon Great House, that marks solstice and lunar standstill.
So can I just, I don't mean to sound dense here, Kim, but so you're saying that, you know, Chimney Rock, you have this real dedicated, you know, monumental structure to observation of the moon, but you're saying they didn't understand the 18.6 year cycle? And that's what I'm confused by.
Well, the first evidence we have people living up in the Chimney Rock Upper Mesa was 1050s. And they could have seen the moon occurring at that time. And you can easily see the gradual movement of the moon, you know, up to the standstill point and then back again. So they can easily anticipate, they could easily have anticipated when the moon was going to be rising between the towers next. And you know, eventually 18 years later, they discovered the moon was beginning to move towards the towers, and then put up a marker. They, I mean, they didn't know 18.6 was the real number. It's something they could just observed casually. That's all. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, no, I wasn't grilling you. I'm just trying to wrap that around my head.
Oh, yeah, I think
they certainly didn't know that the orbit of the moon was tilted by 5 degrees to the ecliptic, and have any theory at all in terms of what the astronomy was.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's important here is that if you know, we're looking at Chimney Rock, if it may have just been an event that they you know, noticed, honored, built something, saw it. But in order for if they brought that over to Mesa Verde in the form of Sun Temple later on, it had to have some meaning beyond just an event.
That's right. Well, as I say, in terms of Chimney Rock, it was very important in terms of the sacred moon and the two divine twins, and maybe in Mesa Verde, what was happening in the Sun Temple was a copy of that.
Yeah,
How many times would you need to observe the moon rising between the chimneys in order to like have the casual observation to know that it was going to happen again? I mean, because it is a long cycle. So do you need to see it twice? And then is looking at almost 2 generations of observing that cycle and then building your thing?
Well, we have dates on the tree rings, and the tree ring date at 1076. We know the cutting date, and that was at the end of the approximately 3-year period when the moon rises between the chimneys. So it almost as though they almost missed it. But then they got the right event. And then in 1093, they began to build and cut trees at the beginning of that time. So it almost seems like it was a hit and miss operation. They could estimate it, but in 1093 they got it right on.
The architecture that those dates are associated with is pretty complex also. So it takes a little bit more than just, just the dates.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks a little bit to your earlier question, Al, about maybe just forming conclusions, and I think that might have been maybe more what you were asking Kim and Greg, because the difference between something like this and a lot of the junk archaeoastronomy that's out in the public culture, like the Orion theory that the pyramids of the Giza Plateau are lined up to the belt of Orion, stuff like that. There's nothing there, and what you really need to do is start getting converging lines of evidence, with the archaeology, and if there's a historical record, and if there's an ethnographic record that you can use, those are wonderful and immensely helpful, but they're not always going to be there. And even if they are, like we're discussing tonight, they may not always be trustworthy, because you may not always be able to project a modern or historical culture into the deep past. So things like the tree rings, and the other thing that's great about Chimney Rock, some of the problems with like with Stonehenge, it's the only one, so we have no comparison, can't say anything really about it, but we have this natural phenomena, Chimney Rock, that was then emulated, possibly emulated, right? Of course, thanks. So it helps you to build stronger arguments than just saying, "Hey, this is what I think." When you have more lines of evidence that can converge, as long as none of them, actually conflict with accepted archaeological. I don't want to say facts, but
So one really nice a final comment about Chimney Rock is that, again, for the Taos Pueblo, they were identified by the twin war gods. And after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, in the spring following that, the Taos came up to Chimney Rock and to this shrine identified as the twin war gods, and performed ceremonies to help the United States win the war in the Pacific with the twin war gods. I think that's absolutely lovely.
yeah.
One thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit that really stuck out to me is the solar eclipse that happens. I've always been a little bit, I don't know, skeptical or something about these tree ring dates, because they do happen on the tail end, which didn't really make sense to me. But I think I didn't know about the solar eclipse that happened. And that makes a lot of sense, that they're seeing this thing happening with the moon, and then a solar eclipse happens. And it's just like, we got to act, we got to do something. That makes sense in my mind. And so I guess I'm wondering, if people are observing this lunar phenomena, what are they maybe thinking about it? Is this a good sign? Is this a bad sign? I mean, generally eclipses are seen pretty negatively. Is it meaning that the moon, just like there's often fears of the sun, it might just keep going on that path and go away forever? I guess I'm just wondering what people might think in that regard.
I don't know, what solar eclipse are you referring to? There was an eclipse in Shalako, 1097.
1076. March 1076.
No, I don't think so. Where?
It's
On your list. On your table 1, chronology of Chimney Rock.
7 March 1076.
Oh, March 1076. I've forgotten about that. Maybe, but we had another. I'm sorry, we had a total eclipse in Chaco Canyon in 1097 that may be marked on the rock of Piedra del Sol. But I'm gonna have to think about this 1076. I don't know where that eclipse was observed. I don't think it was on Chimney Rock itself.
In your paper, you say that it would have been partial there rather than total.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a real difference between partial and total solar eclipses. Partial eclipses are very scary. And if you're not living in the eclipse line, it is a very negative experience because you see the sun getting attacked. Whereas a total eclipse, you're seeing an absolutely glorious and beautiful and unexpected side of the sun that you have been worshiping all along and have been using as another phenomena of the natural world. Whereas if you're on the center line of the eclipse, it's a completely different experience. And I think this idea that people saw eclipses be negative has been totally colored by the fact that most of the people associated with an eclipse are going to see a partial eclipse. Whereas those who are seeing the total eclipse would be just, I think, completely awed. And it would be essentially a very positive experience of seeing this beautiful other aspect of the sun that they never imagined would take place. So for a total eclipse, I think that is a very transformative experience for people. But for the partial eclipse, that's it could easily be negative.
Look, Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have a different perspective. But the way I thought about it reading your paper is, of course, the period of the maximum standstill is a rather long period. It lasts the span of a couple of years.
3 years probably, yeah, at Chimney Rock, yeah, depending on where you stand.
So they caught the tail end of the second one.
Yeah, they
probably, and they thought, well, this is something special. They cut down trees and they started construction, and then it was there. And then my impression is, roughly 18 years later, they said, hey, look, it's happening again, and they cut more trees. It's nothing that they had anticipated.
Well, it's more than cutting trees. It was, as Greg says,
right.
It was a major structure, monumental structure construction at the Great House.
But because they saw it again, and said, hey, this is happening again. Not that it was recognized as a cycle, correct?
Came back, yeah. No, I certainly wouldn't know about the cycle. And then, of course, it never was seen again. Chimney Rock was abandoned around 1100, which was the same time that salmon was abandoned. So I think there's a interesting connection there, which we really don't understand. Salmon and Chimney Rock, as opposed to Aztec in Chimney Rock. There doesn't seem to be any connection there at all, because Aztec, of course, was flourished in the 1100s, and yet Chimney Rock was not important for them at all.
I have a question about the Chimney Rock, the feather holders, the ceramic feather holders. Are those also found at Salmon and or Chaco, or are they just at Salmon and Chimney Rock?
Well, they're primarily in Chimney Rock, and there is one that was carried down to Pueblo Bonito, in Chaco Canyon. The feather holders are primarily a Chimney Rock phenomenon.
Presumably they're pajos to prayer feathers.
Well, they're rectangular, low temperature fired ceramic pieces that have holes in them that look as though feathers were placed in them.
Yeah.
We really don't know the details of their meaning.
Yeah, they're presumably feather holders. They,
Okay.
they had some, there were some, I believe, some ethnographic in Renaud's or some of the records I reviewed for Chimney Rock talking about some Pueblo people using them to hold feathers, something like that. You know, clay devices that were used for holding feathers, and that's where they got the feather holder. So that's an interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah, this is something we want to be very careful about because we really don't know its ceremonial meaning. But that's the name has been given to them.
Yeah, and that's the danger of giving things names that are an interpretation.
Yeah.
Because they carry that and it sticks with them. And we're in. Yeah, I think, Chris, I think we're just about done here. We're an hour and a half into it today.
Yep, we are. I think that's about it. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I thought we had a great conversation tonight.